For more than a century, people have entered the Superstition Mountains of Arizona believing that somewhere among its canyons and cliffs lies a hidden gold mine. Some came with maps passed down through families. Others followed fragments of stories told in whispers or printed in old newspapers. Many never found what they were searching for. Some never returned at all. Yet no confirmed mine has ever been produced, no verified gold vein uncovered, and no single account proven beyond doubt. What remains is one of the most persistent legends in American mining history, built around a real landscape, real people, and a trail of claims that blur the line between fact and belief. This is the story of the Lost Dutchman Mine, not as folklore, but as history allows it to be told. The Superstition Mountains rise sharply from the desert east of present-day Phoenix, a rugged and imposing range shaped by volcanic activity millions of years ago. Steep ridges, narrow canyons, and jagged rock formations dominate the landscape, creating a terrain that is difficult to navigate even with modern equipment. Summer temperatures regularly exceed extreme levels, while sudden storms can bring flash floods through dry washes without warning. For much of recorded history, this environment has been viewed as hostile, unpredictable, and dangerous, yet it has also drawn explorers, miners, and settlers driven by the promise of hidden wealth beneath the desert stone. Long before any stories of lost gold mines emerged, the Superstition Mountains were home to indigenous peoples who understood the land through generations of lived experience. Archaeological evidence shows that human presence in central Arizona dates back thousands of years, with cultures adapting to the desert through seasonal movement, farming, hunting, and trade. Among these groups were the ancestors of the modern Western Apache, including the Apache Yavapai, who lived in and around the mountain range. For them, the superstitions were not merely a physical landscape but a place woven into spiritual belief, oral history, and survival knowledge. Certain areas were treated with caution or reverence, not because of hidden treasure, but because of the power and danger the land itself represented. Spanish exploration introduced new interests into the region during the 16th and 17th centuries. Driven by the pursuit of mineral wealth, Spanish expeditions moved north from Mexico into what is now the American Southwest. Historical records confirm that Spanish explorers and missionaries traveled through parts of Arizona, mapping routes and searching for gold and silver deposits. While large-scale Spanish mining operations flourished elsewhere in New Spain, particularly in present-day Mexico, there is no verified evidence that the Spanish established productive mines within the Superstition Mountains themselves. However, the belief that Spanish miners discovered rich or in remote locations, then concealed or abandoned those sites during periods of conflict, became a recurring theme in later frontier lore. After Mexico gained independence from Spain in 1821, control of Arizona passed to the Mexican government. The region remained sparsely populated, with limited infrastructure and ongoing conflict between indigenous groups and outside settlers. Mining continued in parts of the Southwest, but activity in central Arizona remained minimal due to instability, isolation, and the difficulty of transportation. When the United States acquired the territory following the Mexican-American War in 1848, Arizona entered a new phase of exploration and settlement. The discovery of gold in California that same year accelerated western migration, drawing prospectors into regions previously considered too remote or dangerous. By the mid-19th century, confirmed gold strikes in Arizona territory began to attract miners, especially after discoveries near Prescott and along the Colorado River. These strikes were documented, productive, and led to the formation of mining camps and towns. Yet the Superstition Mountains remained largely unworked by comparison. Their rough terrain, limited water sources, and reputation for danger discouraged systematic mining efforts. For many prospectors, the risk outweighed the potential reward, especially when more accessible deposits were available elsewhere. It was during this period of expanding frontier activity that stories of hidden mines began to circulate more widely. These stories often followed a familiar pattern. A lone prospector or small group discovers a rich vein of gold in a remote area, keeps its location secret, and later dies or disappears without revealing the site. In the case of the Superstition Mountains, such narratives were shaped by real historical conditions. Mining secrecy was common in the 19th century, as claim disputes, theft, and violence were frequent. Prospectors who believed they had found valuable ground often avoided public disclosure until they could secure legal ownership or sufficient resources to work the claim. The geography of the superstitions contributed to the plausibility of such stories. Narrow canyons could conceal small mining operations. Volcanic rock formations could hide veins of quartz. Seasonal floods could alter landmarks and erase trails. Even experienced outdoorsmen could become disoriented in the maze of ridges and ravines. These factors made it possible for rumors to persist without verification, especially in an era when accurate maps were scarce and communication was slow. At the same time, conflict between settlers and Apache groups intensified throughout Arizona Territory during the mid to late 19th century. These conflicts were real, violent, and well documented. Travel through certain regions required armed escorts, and isolated prospectors faced genuine danger. Over time, these conditions became woven into later retellings of the Lost Dutchman story, sometimes exaggerated or misrepresented, but rooted in a historical environment where secrecy, fear, and survival were daily realities. By the time the legend of the Lost Dutchman Mine began to take recognizable form in the late 19th century, it was already shaped by decades of frontier experience, mining culture, and oral tradition. The story did not emerge suddenly, nor did it originate from a single source. Instead, it evolved gradually, drawing credibility from the real presence of gold in Arizona, the documented dangers of the landscape, and the existence of individuals who lived solitary lives on the margins of frontier society. Understanding this context is essential. The Lost Dutchman Mine cannot be separated from the land that inspired it or the historical forces that allowed such a legend to endure. Before any individual figure entered the story, before any map or dying confession was recorded, the Superstition Mountains themselves set the stage. They were a place where wealth and danger coexisted, where knowledge was fragmented, and where belief could flourish in the absence of proof. It is within this setting that the story of the Lost Dutchman Mine begins, not as a confirmed discovery, but as a possibility shaped by history, environment, and human expectation. As American settlement expanded into Arizona Territory during the mid-19th century, mining activity increased across the region, driven by confirmed gold and silver discoveries elsewhere in the Southwest. These developments gave rise to a broader belief that Arizona's mountain ranges held untapped mineral wealth, even in areas where no productive mines had been documented. The Superstition Mountains, despite their forbidding terrain, became part of this belief system, not because of proven success, but because they remained largely unexplored and difficult to access. In frontier culture, unexplored land often invited speculation, especially when nearby regions had already yielded gold. Spanish and Mexican mining activity in Arizona has frequently been cited as the origin of Lost Dutchman Mine stories. It is historically accurate that Spanish prospectors mined extensively throughout New Spain and established major operations in what is now Mexico. There is also documented evidence of Spanish travel through central Arizona, including missionary routes and military expeditions. However, careful examination of surviving Spanish records reveals no verified documentation of a productive gold mine within the Superstition Mountains. No mine locations, production logs, or transportation records exist that would confirm sustained Spanish mining activity in that specific range. This absence of evidence does not prove that no prospecting occurred, but it does establish that any such activity left no verifiable historical footprint. During the Mexican period, from 1821 to 1848, Arizona remained a peripheral and unstable frontier. Mining continued sporadically in safer regions, but persistent conflict, limited infrastructure, and difficult geography discouraged deep penetration into the superstitions. When Arizona became part of the United States following the Mexican-American War, prospectors brought new attention to the territory. The discovery of gold in California had created a culture of rapid exploration, where rumors were often enough to draw men into dangerous environments. Still, even as documented gold strikes emerged in northern and western Arizona, the Superstition Mountains remained relatively untouched by organized mining efforts. The lack of confirmed mining did not prevent stories from circulating. In mining communities, oral tradition played a powerful role. Prospectors frequently shared accounts of rumored discoveries, secret locations, and hidden riches, especially during periods when accessible gold fields became depleted. These stories often blended fact with speculation, shaped by personal experience and the hardships of frontier life. Over time, repetition gave them a sense of authority, even when no physical evidence existed. In the case of the Superstitions, tales of Spanish gold mines abandoned during Apache conflicts became especially persistent, despite the absence of supporting documentation. Conflict between Apache groups and settlers during the mid to late 19th century was real and severe, and it strongly influenced frontier narratives. Travel through central Arizona could be dangerous, and isolated miners were vulnerable. These conditions contributed to the plausibility of stories involving secret mines protected by violence or secrecy. Yet historical records show that most confirmed mining operations in Arizona operated under military protection or within relatively secure zones. There is no verified record of a Spanish or Mexican mining camp in the Superstitions being abandoned due to attack while transporting significant quantities of gold. As American mining expanded, legal frameworks developed to regulate claims, ownership, and production. Mining districts recorded claims, locations, and transfers, many of which survive today. Extensive research into these records has failed to produce evidence of a registered gold mine within the Superstition Mountains that matches descriptions associated with the Lost Dutchman legend. This absence is significant, as even secretive prospectors typically registered claims once they believed production was viable. Unregistered mines existed, but they rarely produced sustained output without attracting attention. By the 1860s and 1870s, Arizona Territory experienced increased settlement, military presence, and economic development. Roads improved, towns formed, and mining knowledge spread. During this period, isolated individuals continued to prospect independently, particularly those who preferred solitude or secrecy. These lone prospectors sometimes lived outside established communities, trading gold dust or nuggets quietly rather than publicly. Such behavior, while uncommon, was not unheard of and later became a key element in stories surrounding hidden mines. It is within this environment that the groundwork for the Lost Dutchman narrative was laid. The story did not yet center on a specific individual, but rather on the idea that a rich gold deposit existed somewhere within the Superstitions, known only to a few and deliberately concealed. This belief was reinforced by the region's reputation for danger, its lack of documented mining success, and the frontier tendency to attribute unexplained wealth to hidden sources rather than chance accumulation. Crucially, historians who have studied the legend emphasize that no contemporary records from the Spanish or Mexican periods describe a lost mine in the Superstition Mountains. The earliest detailed accounts of such a mine appear much later, filtered through memory, second-hand testimony, and interpretation. This temporal gap matters. It suggests that the legend evolved gradually rather than originating from a single, documented discovery. By the time the story began to take a more recognizable form in the late 19th century, it was already detached from verifiable origins. What remained was a compelling idea, that somewhere in one of the most difficult landscapes in Arizona lay a source of gold that had eluded discovery for generations. This idea persisted not because it was proven, but because it aligned with frontier experience, mining culture, and human belief in hidden opportunity. As settlement increased and mining records became more comprehensive, the absence of evidence became harder to ignore. Yet rather than weakening the story, this absence strengthened it for some. A mine that could not be found, documented, or proven became more intriguing than one that could. It was within this paradox, where lack of proof became part of the appeal, that the Lost Dutchman Mine legend gained momentum, setting the stage for the individuals who would soon become central to its story. By the latter half of the 19th century, Arizona Territory had become a place shaped by tension, ambition, and uncertainty. The American Civil War had ended, but its effects lingered in the West, where military authority, civilian settlement, and indigenous resistance intersected in complex ways. Arizona remained sparsely populated, with isolated towns connected by rough trails rather than reliable roads. Mining camps rose and fell quickly, depending on the success of nearby claims, and many prospectors lived on the edge of financial failure. In such an environment, secrecy and caution were not unusual but necessary. Mining in Arizona during this period was a hazardous endeavor. Confirmed gold and silver discoveries brought waves of prospectors, but success was uneven. Most miners worked claims that produced little, and many abandoned their efforts after months or years of labor. Violence over claims, theft of ore, and disputes between rival groups were common enough to shape mining culture. As a result, prospectors who believed they had found valuable ground often avoided publicity, choosing instead to work quietly or conceal the location of their discoveries until they could protect them. At the same time, conflict between settlers and Apache groups intensified across central and eastern Arizona. These conflicts are well documented in military records, territorial correspondence, and contemporary newspapers. Travel through certain regions required armed escorts, and isolated individuals were at genuine risk. The Superstition Mountains, lying near contested territory and far from strong military protection, gained a reputation as a dangerous and unpredictable place. Over time, this reputation became intertwined with mining rumors, reinforcing the idea that valuable discoveries could be hidden or lost amid violence and fear. It was during this period that individual prospectors, living outside conventional mining communities, became central figures in frontier storytelling. Some were immigrants with limited family ties. Others were men who preferred isolation or had failed to integrate into established towns. These individuals often moved between regions, working claims temporarily, trading small amounts of gold, and avoiding attention. Their lives left few written records, making later reconstruction difficult. Yet it was precisely this lack of documentation that allowed stories about them to grow. Frontier newspapers played an important role in shaping public perception. Sensational stories attracted readers, and mining rumors were popular content. Reports often blurred the line between fact and speculation, especially when they involved remote regions that reporters themselves had never visited. Over time, repeated retelling gave unverified claims an appearance of credibility. Once a story entered print, it could be cited by others, even when its original source was unclear. This process contributed significantly to the development of mining legends across the West. In Arizona, the combination of real mining success elsewhere and persistent rumors in unexplored regions created fertile ground for legend-making. The Superstition Mountains, still largely undocumented in mining records, became a natural focal point. Prospectors who passed through the area and later appeared with gold elsewhere were sometimes assumed to have found a hidden source, even when alternative explanations were more plausible. Gold could be accumulated gradually through small claims, wages, or trading, but mystery often proved more compelling than mundane reality. As territorial governance expanded, mining regulations became more formalized. Claims were recorded, disputes adjudicated, and production monitored to a greater degree than in earlier decades. This increased transparency made it increasingly unlikely that a large, productive mine could operate unnoticed for long. Historians examining surviving records have found no evidence of sustained gold extraction from within the Superstition Mountains during this period. This absence is not accidental. It reflects the growing administrative reach of territorial authorities. Despite this, belief in a hidden mine persisted, fueled by stories passed orally rather than through official channels. These stories often emphasized secrecy, danger, and sudden disappearance. They reflected a frontier mindset shaped by uncertainty and loss. Many prospectors died poor, far from family, leaving behind little more than rumor. In such cases, it was easy for communities to fill gaps in knowledge with speculation. A man who lived alone, avoided conversation, and possessed gold could quickly become the subject of elaborate theories after his death. The cultural environment of the time also encouraged romanticization of the frontier. Popular literature and dime novels portrayed the West as a place of adventure, mystery, and individual triumph. These narratives influenced how real events were interpreted and remembered. Mining stories, in particular, lent themselves to dramatic retelling, with themes of perseverance, betrayal, and hidden fortune. Over time, the distinction between entertainment and history became blurred in the public imagination. By the late 1870s and 1880s, Arizona's mining economy had matured, but opportunities for new discoveries diminished. As easily accessible gold became scarce, attention shifted toward the idea of lost or hidden mines. These stories offered hope in a period of declining prospects. For miners who had spent years without success, the belief that a rich deposit existed just beyond reach was psychologically powerful. It allowed failure to be framed not as personal defeat, but as misfortune or secrecy. Within this context, the groundwork was laid for the emergence of a central figure around whom the legend could coalesce. The Lost Dutchman Mine did not yet have a name or a single protagonist, but the conditions necessary for such a story were firmly in place. A harsh landscape, a culture of secrecy, incomplete records, and a population accustomed to hardship all contributed to an environment where belief could persist without proof. When an individual later appeared whose life seemed to fit the pattern of secrecy and unexplained wealth, the existing framework readily absorbed him. The legend did not need to be invented from nothing, it only needed a focal point. By the time that happened, the Superstition Mountains were already primed to become more than a geographic location. They were becoming a symbol of unanswered questions, unverified claims, and the enduring human tendency to believe that somewhere, hidden just beyond certainty, a great fortune remained undiscovered. Jacob Waltz was a real person, not a fictional creation, and much of what is known about him comes from public records rather than legend. He was born around 1810 in the Kingdom of Württemberg, in what is now Germany. Like many Europeans of his generation, Waltz emigrated to the United States during a period of widespread economic hardship and political unrest. Records indicate that he arrived in America during the 1830s or early 1840s, part of a larger movement of German-speaking immigrants seeking opportunity in the expanding Western territories. Waltz's early years in the United States are only partially documented, but census records and later accounts suggest that he lived and worked in several frontier regions before arriving in Arizona. He appears to have spent time in the American Midwest and later in California, where gold mining had attracted thousands following the discovery at Sutter's Mill. This background is important, as it establishes that Waltz was familiar with mining practices and frontier life long before his name became associated with the Superstition Mountains. He was not an inexperienced dreamer, but a man shaped by decades of hard labor and uncertainty. By the 1860s, Jacob Waltz was living in the Arizona Territory, where mining opportunities continued to draw prospectors despite the region's dangers. Territorial records place him in and around the Phoenix and Wickenburg areas, working as a miner and occasionally as a laborer. He was known among contemporaries as a quiet and private individual, not prone to socializing or public displays. Such behavior was not unusual among older prospectors who had experienced repeated failure and loss, but it would later contribute to perceptions of secrecy surrounding him. Waltz became a naturalized U.S. citizen in the 1860s, a fact confirmed by court documents. This process required residency, witnesses, and legal acknowledgement, placing him firmly within the documented framework of territorial society. He owned small parcels of land at various times and registered mining claims like many other prospectors. None of these recorded claims, however, correspond to the location later attributed to the Lost Dutchman Mine. This distinction is critical, as it demonstrates that Waltz did participate in the legal mining system, rather than operating entirely outside it. Throughout his life, Waltz lived modestly. Contemporary descriptions portray him as physically small, aging, and often in poor health. He was not known to display wealth openly. There is no verified evidence that he possessed large quantities of gold during his lifetime, nor that he transported or in amounts consistent with a major mining operation. What little gold he may have had could plausibly have come from small claims, wages, or trade rather than from a single extraordinary source. In the years leading up to his death, Waltz lived primarily in Phoenix, often boarding with acquaintances rather than maintaining a permanent household. His declining health limited his ability to work, and he relied on others for care during his final illness. It is during this period, in 1891, that the most consequential claims about his life emerged. According to later testimony, Waltz allegedly spoke of a rich gold mine hidden in the Superstition Mountains and provided directions to its location. These claims form the core of the Lost Dutchman legend, but their reliability depends entirely on second-hand accounts recorded after his death. The primary source of these accounts is Julia Thomas, a Phoenix resident who reportedly cared for Waltz during his final days. Thomas later claimed that Waltz described the mine's location in detail, though her recollections were recorded years after the fact and vary across retellings. Other individuals also claimed to have heard similar stories from Waltz at different times. None of these statements were written or signed by Waltz himself, and no contemporary documentation exists to confirm their accuracy. This reliance on memory rather than written evidence poses a significant challenge for historians. It is also important to consider the broader context in which these accounts were recorded. By the time Thomas and others shared their stories publicly, the idea of a lost mine in the superstitions had already gained traction. The possibility of fame, fortune, or financial reward created incentives for exaggeration or reinterpretation. While this does not automatically invalidate their claims, it does require careful scrutiny. Historians generally treat such accounts as unverified testimony rather than established fact. Waltz's death in October 1891 marked the point at which his personal history ended and the legend fully began. With no direct statements from him preserved in writing, his life became open to interpretation. The gap between what is documented and what is claimed allowed the story to grow beyond its factual foundation. Over time, Waltz himself became known as the Dutchman, a term derived from a common linguistic confusion between Deutsch, meaning German, and Dutch, a mislabel applied to German immigrants in 19th-century America. What remains verifiable is that Jacob Waltz was an aging immigrant prospector who lived and worked in Arizona during a period of frontier expansion. He experienced the hardships common to his profession and died without leaving behind clear evidence of extraordinary success. There is no record of him owning a productive mine in the Superstition Mountains, nor of him registering claims consistent with later descriptions of the Lost Dutchman Mine. These facts do not disprove the legend, but they define its limits. Understanding Jacob Waltz as a historical figure rather than a mythical one is essential to evaluating the Lost Dutchman story responsibly. He was neither a proven discoverer of immense wealth nor a fabricated character invented for entertainment. He existed within a real historical framework, shaped by migration, mining culture, and frontier life. The legend that grew around his name reflects not only what may or may not have happened in the Superstition Mountains, but also the human tendency to fill uncertainty with narrative. By examining Waltz's life through documented evidence rather than assumption, the story becomes more grounded and more revealing. It shifts focus from the promise of hidden gold to the ways in which memory, circumstance, and belief transform ordinary lives into enduring mysteries. It is from this point, after Waltz's death, that the legend takes on momentum, driven not by his actions, but by the interpretations and pursuits of those who came after him. After Jacob Waltz's death in 1891, the story of the Lost Dutchman Mine shifted from private rumor to public pursuit. What had once been fragments of conversation and scattered speculation became a set of narratives repeated, compared, and eventually published. At the center of these narratives were claims about what Waltz allegedly revealed during the final months and days of his life. These claims form the most detailed descriptions of the supposed mine, yet they also represent the weakest link in terms of historical certainty, relying entirely on memory rather than written record. The most frequently cited account comes from Julia Thomas, a Phoenix resident who reportedly provided care for Waltz during his final illness. According to Thomas, Waltz spoke of a rich gold mine hidden deep within the Superstition Mountains and gave her directions to reach it. Her recollections were not recorded immediately after his death, but rather years later, when public interest in the legend had already grown. Over time, Thomas gave multiple versions of the story, each containing slight variations in detail. These inconsistencies do not necessarily imply deception, but they do illustrate the difficulty of relying on human memory, especially when recalling complex directions and events long after they occurred. Other individuals also claimed to have heard stories from Waltz at different times. Some said he spoke of traveling into the superstitions alone and returning with gold. Others claimed he mentioned landmarks, such as distinctive rock formations or specific canyons. None of these alleged conversations were documented while Waltz was alive, and none were corroborated by independent witnesses at the time. As a result, historians treat these accounts as oral testimony rather than factual evidence. One of the most important aspects of these claims is the lack of consistency between them. Descriptions of the mine's location vary widely, sometimes placing it near known trails, sometimes deep within inaccessible canyons. Some versions describe the mine as a simple placer deposit, while others portray it as a rich vein of quartz gold. These contradictions make it impossible to reconstruct a single, coherent description of the mine based solely on testimony. Instead, They suggest that the story evolved over time, shaped by retelling, interpretation, and expectation. The timing of these accounts is also significant. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were a period of intense interest in lost mines and hidden treasure. Newspapers published stories that blurred fact and fiction, often without rigorous verification. Books and pamphlets repeated earlier claims, sometimes embellishing them for dramatic effect. As the Lost Dutchman story entered print, each retelling added new details while reinforcing the belief that the mine was real. Once a narrative became widely accepted, it was rarely questioned, even when evidence was lacking. Maps attributed to Waltz began to appear during this period, further complicating the story. Some were claimed to be copies of original sketches. Others were said to be interpretations based on verbal descriptions. None can be conclusively traced to Waltz himself. Analysis of these maps reveals inconsistencies in geography and scale, and some include landmarks that do not align with the actual terrain of the Superstition Mountains. Despite this, such maps were often treated as authoritative by those eager to believe in the mine's existence. The role of confirmation bias cannot be ignored. Searchers who entered the superstitions with a specific narrative in mind often interpreted natural features as validation of what they believed. Rock formations became markers, shadows suggested symbols, and ordinary mineral deposits were seen as signs of something greater nearby. This process reinforced belief even in the absence of tangible results. Failed searches were explained away as near misses, while partial success was taken as proof that the mine existed just beyond reach. It is also important to recognize that gold mining in Arizona was real and ongoing during this period. Waltz did not need a single extraordinary mine to possess small amounts of gold. Prospectors frequently accumulated gold through years of modest work, trading, or wages. The presence of gold alone does not imply the existence of a hidden bonanza. Yet in the context of legend, ordinary explanations often lost appeal in favor of more dramatic interpretations. As the story spread, it became increasingly difficult to separate Waltz's documented life from the legend attached to his name. Later writers often treated unverified claims as established facts, repeating them without acknowledging uncertainty. Over time, the distinction between what Waltz may have said and what others believed he meant grew blurred. This process transformed a collection of anecdotal accounts into what appeared to be a cohesive narrative, even though its foundation remained unstable. Historians examining the Lost Dutchman Mine emphasize the importance of source evaluation. Accounts recorded decades after the events they describe must be treated cautiously, especially when they involve extraordinary claims. In the absence of physical evidence, such as a verified mine site, authenticated documents, or contemporary records, testimony alone cannot establish historical fact. This does not render the story meaningless, but it places it firmly within the realm of legend rather than confirmed history. The enduring power of the Lost Dutchman narrative lies not in what can be proven, but in how belief persists despite uncertainty. Each retelling reinforced the idea that knowledge had been lost, that clues remained hidden, and that success depended on interpretation rather than evidence. This framework encouraged continued searching, even as repeated efforts failed to produce results. By the early 20th century, the story had taken on a life of its own, independent of Jacob Waltz as an individual. His alleged words became a starting point for countless interpretations, searches, and debates. What began as a series of unverified conversations evolved into one of the most enduring mining legends in American history. From this point forward, the focus shifted from what Waltz may have known to what others believed could still be found, drawing generation after generation into the Superstition Mountains in search of something that history has yet to confirm. As the story of the Lost Dutchman Mine spread beyond those who had known Jacob Waltz personally, attention turned increasingly toward maps, symbols, and supposed clues said to point the way to the hidden location. These materials became central to the legend, offering the promise of precision in a story otherwise built on uncertainty. Yet it is precisely here, where certainty was most desired, that the historical record becomes weakest. No authenticated map created by Waltz has ever been produced. Every known example surfaced only after his death and lacks verifiable provenance. Many of the maps attributed to the Lost Dutchman Mine appeared in the early 20th century, often passed between private individuals or published in books and magazines. Some were said to be copies of originals, others interpretations of verbal directions. None were accompanied by contemporaneous documentation linking them directly to Waltz. In several cases, handwriting analysis and paper dating indicate that the materials could not have originated during his lifetime. These findings do not prove deliberate fabrication, but they do demonstrate that the maps cannot be treated as primary evidence. Geographic inconsistencies further undermine the reliability of these documents. Some maps depict landmarks that do not exist in the Superstition Mountains, while others misrepresent distances, orientations, or elevations in ways that conflict with known topography. The superstitions are a complex volcanic range with irregular formations, yet many maps simplify the terrain into symbols that could apply to countless locations. When examined critically, these representations offer little practical guidance and often contradict one another. The use of symbolic markers is another recurring element in Lost Dutchman lore. Stories frequently reference carvings, stone arrangements, or shadow patterns said to indicate directions or distances. However, no such markers have been conclusively linked to mining activity. Archaeologists studying the region caution that many stone features attributed to miners are more likely natural formations or indigenous cultural sites unrelated to gold extraction. Misinterpretation of these features has led to repeated claims of discovery that fail under scrutiny. Confirmation bias plays a significant role in how these clues are perceived. Searchers who enter the Superstition Mountains with a specific map or theory often interpret the landscape to fit their expectations. A rock face becomes a symbol, a canyon becomes a pathway, and erosion patterns are read as intentional markings. This process reinforces belief even when physical evidence is absent. Failed searches are often rationalized as errors in interpretation rather than evidence that the premise itself may be flawed. The contradiction between the alleged richness of the mine and the absence of physical traces is one of the most significant challenges to the legend. A productive gold mine would leave behind unmistakable signs, including tailings, adits, tools, or transportation routes. Extensive exploration of the Superstition Mountains by hikers, prospectors, archaeologists, and government agencies has not revealed evidence of such activity consistent with the descriptions found in Lost Dutchman accounts. While small, short-lived prospecting efforts could escape detection, sustained extraction of rich ore would be difficult to conceal indefinitely. Historical mining records further complicate the story. Territorial and state documents contain detailed information about mining claims, ownership disputes, and production throughout Arizona. These records have been examined extensively, yet none describe a mine within the superstitions that matches the characteristics attributed to the Lost Dutchman. This absence suggests that if such a mine existed, it either produced very little or operated entirely outside the legal and economic structures of the time, which would have been highly unusual. Another source of confusion lies in the blending of multiple stories into a single narrative. Over time, accounts of different prospectors, locations, and discoveries appear to have merged, creating a composite legend. Some descriptions attributed to Waltz resemble known mining sites elsewhere in Arizona, while others echo older Spanish mining tales unrelated to the superstitions. As these stories converged, distinctions blurred, and the resulting legend became increasingly difficult to disentangle. The passage of time has also altered the landscape itself. Flash floods, rockslides, and erosion have reshaped canyons and washes, erasing trails and changing landmarks. While this has been cited as an explanation for why the mine remains hidden, it also complicates efforts to match historical descriptions with present-day geography. In many cases, directions that once seemed plausible cannot be reconciled with the physical environment, even allowing for natural change. Despite these contradictions, belief in the maps persists. For some, the very difficulty of verification enhances their appeal. A map that cannot be easily proven wrong offers endless possibility, inviting reinterpretation rather than resolution. Each failed search generates new theories, new overlays, and new explanations, extending the life of the legend without bringing it closer to confirmation. Historians emphasize that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. In the case of the Lost Dutchman Mine, such evidence has never been produced. Maps, symbols, and clues remain speculative, unsupported by physical proof or reliable documentation. This does not diminish their cultural significance, but it does define their historical status. They are artifacts of belief rather than evidence of fact. As the 20th century progressed, the focus of the Lost Dutchman story shifted away from documentation and toward persistence. The absence of confirmation became part of the narrative, reinforcing the idea that the mine was meant to remain hidden. In this way, contradiction did not weaken the legend but strengthened it, transforming uncertainty into purpose. What could not be found could still be believed, and what could not be proven could still be pursued. By this point, the legend had fully detached from its original historical context. Jacob Waltz was no longer simply an aging prospector, and the Superstition Mountains were no longer just a difficult landscape. They had become symbols of mystery, interpretation, and unresolved promise. The maps and clues, flawed though they may be, served as gateways into the symbolic world, ensuring that the search would continue long after the last verifiable connection to fact had faded. In the years following Jacob Waltz's death, the legend of the Lost Dutchman Mine moved from private speculation into organized pursuit. What had once been stories shared quietly among prospectors became a motivation for expeditions, partnerships, and prolonged searches in the Superstition Mountains. These efforts were not random wanderings driven purely by imagination. Many were carefully planned, drawing on the maps, testimonies, and interpretations that had begun to circulate. Yet despite decades of searching, none produced verifiable evidence of a mine matching the legend's claims. One of the earliest documented attempts to locate the mine was undertaken by Julia Thomas herself. Believing she had received reliable directions from Waltz, Thomas organized an expedition into the Superstitions in the early 1890s. Accounts of this journey indicate that it was difficult and ultimately unsuccessful. Thomas reportedly became disoriented in the rugged terrain and returned without finding the mine. Her failure did not end belief in her story, but it did raise questions about the accuracy of the directions she claimed to possess. As the 20th century began, interest in the Lost Dutchman Mine increased rather than faded. Arizona was becoming more accessible, and improved transportation allowed more people to enter the Superstition Mountains. Prospectors, adventurers, and amateur treasure hunters followed a wide range of theories, often based on second-hand accounts rather than first-hand evidence. Some searched alone, while others formed small groups, pooling resources and information. Most kept detailed notes, yet few published their findings, especially when searches ended without success. Several expeditions became well known due to their scale or the personalities involved. Some searchers devoted years, even decades, to exploring specific areas of the mountains. They examined canyons repeatedly, marking rock formations and studying shadow patterns at different times of year. Despite this sustained effort, no mine entrance, or vein, or significant mining debris was ever conclusively identified. In some cases, small traces of past prospecting were found, but these were consistent with minor exploratory work common throughout the region and did not indicate large-scale gold extraction. The role of media cannot be overlooked. Newspapers and magazines published accounts of expeditions, often emphasizing mystery and danger over evidence. Stories of near discoveries were presented alongside speculation, keeping public interest alive. Over time, these reports contributed to a feedback loop in which belief fueled searching, and searching fueled belief regardless of outcome. Failed expeditions were rarely treated as disproof. Instead, they were framed as evidence that the mine remained cleverly concealed. Tragedy also became associated with the search, further intensifying the legend. A small number of deaths occurred in the Superstition Mountains during the 20th century, some involving individuals known to be searching for the Lost Dutchman Mine. These incidents are real and documented, though they are often exaggerated or misrepresented in later retellings. Most fatalities resulted from environmental hazards such as heat exhaustion, dehydration, falls, or sudden storms. The superstitions are genuinely dangerous terrain, and deaths there do not require supernatural explanation. Nevertheless, such events were frequently woven into the narrative as evidence of a curse or protective force surrounding the mine. It is important to distinguish between documented facts and later embellishment. While deaths occurred, there is no evidence that they were unusually frequent compared to accidents in similar wilderness areas. Nor is there proof that individuals died as a direct result of discovering or approaching a gold mine. The association between danger and the legend developed gradually, shaped by repetition rather than statistical reality. This association, however, added emotional weight to the story and discouraged skepticism. Throughout these decades, government agencies also played a role, though indirectly. As parts of the Superstition Mountains were designated as protected land, mining activity became restricted. These protections were implemented to preserve the natural environment rather than to conceal hidden treasure. Still, restrictions on excavation and prospecting reinforced the idea that something remained undiscovered, beyond reach by law as well as by effort. Researchers and historians who later examined search records noted a recurring pattern. Many expeditions relied on reinterpretations of the same limited set of clues. Maps were overlaid on modern topographic charts. Oral descriptions were matched to prominent landmarks. Each new theory claimed to resolve contradictions found in earlier attempts, yet none produced physical confirmation. Over time, the same areas were searched repeatedly under different assumptions, yielding the same result: absence of proof. What is striking is the persistence of belief in the face of repeated failure. For some searchers, the lack of success reinforced the idea that the mine was deliberately hidden or protected by knowledge lost to time. For others, the search itself became the purpose, independent of outcome. The Superstition Mountains offered a sense of challenge and meaning that extended beyond gold. In this way, the legend sustained itself even as evidence remained elusive. By the mid-20th century, the Lost Dutchman Mine had become less a specific location and more a symbol. Searches continued, but they were increasingly informed by personal interpretation rather than historical documentation. The original context of Jacob Waltz's life and words grew distant, replaced by layers of assumption and expectation. Each expedition added to the story, not by discovery, but by experience. The cumulative result of these searches is revealing. After decades of exploration by individuals motivated, determined, and often well-prepared, no verifiable mine has been found. This outcome does not conclusively disprove the legend, but it places it firmly outside the realm of confirmed history. What remains is a record of human effort rather than material success, a testament to the power of belief and the enduring appeal of unanswered questions. As the search continued into the modern era, attention began to shift. Rather than focusing solely on finding the mine, historians and researchers increasingly examined why the legend persisted and what it revealed about those who pursued it. In doing so, the Lost Dutchman Mine became as much a subject of cultural study as of geological interest. The story had outgrown its original claims, becoming a mirror reflecting human hope, resilience, and the desire to uncover meaning in uncertain places. As the Lost Dutchman Mine legend spread through the 20th century, stories of danger became inseparable from the search itself. Over time, the Superstition Mountains gained a reputation not only as the hiding place of lost gold, but as a landscape marked by death and misfortune. This reputation did not emerge from fiction alone. The mountains are genuinely hazardous, and fatalities have occurred there, though the reasons for these deaths are often misunderstood or misrepresented in popular retellings. The Superstition Mountains present real and well-documented dangers. Extreme heat is the most significant threat. Summer temperatures regularly exceed levels that can quickly lead to dehydration and heat exhaustion. Water sources are scarce and unreliable, and many washes that appear navigable can become impassable after storms. Steep cliffs, loose volcanic rock, and narrow canyons increase the risk of falls. Sudden weather changes can bring flash floods, while winter conditions at higher elevations can expose hikers to cold and wind. These hazards exist regardless of any legend and have claimed lives both before and after the Lost Dutchman story gained prominence. A number of individuals known to be searching for the Lost Dutchman Mine have died in or near the Superstition Mountains. These deaths are real and documented, but they are often grouped together in ways that suggest a pattern where none can be demonstrated. When examined individually, most fatalities resulted from causes common to wilderness travel in arid environments. Heat-related illness, accidents, and disorientation account for the majority. There is no verified evidence that any person died as a direct result of discovering the mine or being deliberately prevented from revealing its location. One of the most frequently cited cases involves Adolf Ruth, an elderly physician who entered the Superstitions in 1931 while searching for the mine. Ruth disappeared, prompting a large search effort. His remains were later found in a remote canyon. Contemporary investigation concluded that he likely died from exposure and injuries sustained while navigating difficult terrain. Despite this, later accounts introduced claims of foul play or hidden clues found with his belongings, none of which were supported by official findings. Ruth's death became emblematic of how tragedy could be absorbed into the legend and reshaped to reinforce belief rather than examined as an isolated incident. Other deaths have followed a similar pattern. Individuals went missing or were found deceased, and their involvement in the search was emphasized while environmental explanations were downplayed. In many cases, the circumstances of death were poorly documented, leaving room for speculation. Over time, speculation hardened into narrative. Accidents became warnings. Misfortune became evidence of protection or curse. This process did not require fabrication. It relied on selective emphasis and repetition. Statistical analysis does not support the idea that the Superstition Mountains are unusually deadly compared to other wilderness areas of similar size and difficulty. While fatalities have occurred, they do not exceed what might be expected given the terrain, climate, and frequency of visitation. The perception of heightened danger is amplified by the legend itself, which ensures that each incident receives disproportionate attention. Deaths unrelated to the mine rarely attract the same interest, reinforcing the belief that the search carries unique risk. The idea of a curse associated with the Lost Dutchman Mine emerged gradually rather than from any specific event. Early accounts focused on danger and secrecy rather than supernatural punishment. As the story evolved, later retellings introduced the notion that the mine was protected, either by fate or by forces beyond human control. This shift reflects broader cultural patterns in how unexplained failure is interpreted. When effort and logic fail repeatedly, symbolic explanations often take their place. Historians note that similar narratives exist around other lost mines and treasures across the American West. In nearly every case, danger becomes a defining feature of the story, even when risks are ordinary. The Lost Dutchman Mine is not unique in this respect, but it stands out due to the longevity and popularity of its legend. Over time, danger itself became part of the attraction, transforming the search into a test of endurance and resolve rather than a practical mining endeavor. The emphasis on danger also served to shield the legend from skepticism. If the mine could not be found, it was because the mountains were deadly or the location was protected. Failure was no longer evidence against the story, but confirmation of its power. This logic allowed belief to persist even as searches multiplied without result. Each tragedy, real or perceived, added weight to the narrative rather than diminishing it. From a historical perspective, this transformation marks a significant turning point. The Lost Dutchman Mine shifted from a question of geology and record to a story shaped by emotion and symbolism. Danger replaced documentation. Experience replaced evidence. The mine became less a physical place than an idea that demanded respect and caution. Modern researchers and land managers emphasize a different lesson. The Superstition Mountains are dangerous not because of legend, but because of natural conditions. Preparation, caution, and respect for the environment are essential. Fatalities occur when these principles are ignored, regardless of motive. The legend does not cause harm, but it can encourage people to underestimate risk or overestimate their ability to navigate difficult terrain. Understanding how danger became intertwined with the Lost Dutchman story helps clarify why the legend has endured. It reveals how human beings respond to uncertainty, loss, and repeated failure. When answers remain elusive, meaning is often found in experience rather than outcome. In this way, the dangers of the Superstition Mountains became part of the legend structure, reinforcing belief even as evidence remained absent. By separating verified incidents from exaggerated claims, the story becomes clearer and more grounded. Tragedy does not prove the existence of a mine, nor does danger confirm protection or curse. What it does reveal is the power of landscape and narrative combined, shaping how events are remembered and interpreted. The Lost Dutchman Mine persists not because it has been proven, but because it occupies a space where fact ends and belief begins, sustained by risk, repetition, and the enduring human fascination with the unknown. As the 20th century progressed, the Lost Dutchman Mine entered a new phase, shaped less by individual prospectors and more by systematic investigation. Advances in archaeology, geology, and historical research brought new tools to a story long dominated by speculation. At the same time, the Superstition Mountains increasingly came under government protection, placing limits on mining and excavation. These developments did not end interest in the legend, but they changed how it was approached. Federal and state agencies began to document the Superstition Mountains more thoroughly as part of land management and conservation efforts. Geological surveys mapped the region's rock formations, mineral content, and fault lines. These surveys confirmed that gold does exist in Arizona and that small deposits are scattered across the state. However, they also showed that the geology of the Superstition Mountains does not align well with descriptions of a large, rich gold mine of the type described in Lost Dutchman accounts. The volcanic nature of the range makes extensive gold-bearing quartz veins less likely than in regions where major gold strikes have historically occurred. Archaeological studies further clarified the picture. Researchers examining the superstitions have identified evidence of indigenous habitation, travel routes, and cultural sites, as well as minor prospecting activity from the 19th century. What they have not found are the remains of a substantial mining operation. There are no verified adits, tailings piles, or structural remnants consistent with sustained gold extraction on the scale suggested by the legend. This absence is particularly notable given the amount of attention the area has received over many decades. Government records also provide important context. Mining claims filed in Arizona from the territorial period onward have been carefully preserved. These documents record who staked claims, where they were located, and how they changed hands. Extensive examination of these records has failed to identify a claim in the Superstition Mountains that corresponds to the Lost Dutchman Mine. While it is theoretically possible for a miner to have worked an unregistered claim briefly, the sustained production implied by legend would almost certainly have left some trace in official documentation. The designation of the Superstition Wilderness area in the mid-20th century further restricted mining and prospecting. These protections were enacted to preserve the natural and cultural integrity of the region, not to conceal hidden resources. Nevertheless, they contributed to the perception that something remained inaccessible. For believers in the legend, legal restrictions became another explanation for why the mine could not be found or verified. Modern technology has also been brought to bear on the mystery. Aerial photography, satellite imagery, and geographic information systems have allowed researchers to analyze terrain with a level of detail unimaginable to earlier searchers. These tools have revealed patterns of erosion, rock composition, and human impact across the range. Despite this increased visibility, no credible evidence of a lost mine has emerged. The landscape, though complex, has yielded no hidden scars consistent with the story's claims. Historians examining the Lost Dutchman Mine increasingly emphasize the importance of methodological rigor. They note that many earlier searches relied on assumptions inherited from previous interpretations rather than independent evidence. Modern scholarship prioritizes primary sources, contemporaneous records, and physical verification. When these standards are applied, the legend fails to meet the criteria required to establish historical fact. This conclusion does not imply deception on the part of those who believed in the mine. Rather, it highlights how stories evolve over time, shaped by context, repetition, and expectation. The Lost Dutchman Mine reflects a broader pattern in frontier history, where unverified claims gain authority through longevity rather than evidence. Once a story becomes culturally embedded, it can persist independently of factual support. The role of popular media has continued to influence perception. Books, documentaries, and television programs often revisit the legend, sometimes emphasizing mystery over analysis. While such portrayals keep the story alive, they can also blur distinctions between investigation and entertainment. Serious researchers caution against conflating unresolved questions with hidden truths. Absence of proof is not proof of concealment. Academic consensus today is cautious and restrained. Most historians and geologists agree that there is no credible evidence supporting the existence of the Lost Dutchman Mine as described in legend. This position is based not on dismissal, but on exhaustive examination of available data. The mine remains unproven not because it is cleverly hidden, but because it lacks the physical and documentary markers that accompany genuine mining operations. At the same time, scholars recognize the value of the legend as a cultural artifact. The Lost Dutchman Mine offers insight into how people interpret uncertainty and invest meaning in landscape. It reveals how hope persists even when evidence is absent, and how narratives adapt to changing circumstances. In this sense, the legend tells a truth of a different kind, not about gold, but about belief. Modern investigations have therefore shifted focus. Rather than asking where the mine is, researchers ask why the story endures. They examine how migration, economic hardship, and frontier mythology shaped the legend's development. They explore how individuals like Jacob Waltz became symbolic figures, absorbing qualities that reflected broader cultural desires and fears. This shift does not diminish the story, it reframes it. The Lost Dutchman Mine becomes a lens through which to view the American experience of exploration and expectation. It reflects a time when vast spaces seemed full of possibility, and when personal perseverance was believed capable of overcoming any obstacle. In a modern context, it serves as a reminder of the limits of belief when separated from evidence. As technology continues to advance and the Superstition Mountains remain protected, the likelihood of discovering new information about the mine diminishes. What remains accessible is the historical record, increasingly well understood and carefully interpreted. Within that record, the Lost Dutchman Mine occupies a distinct place, not as a proven location, but as an enduring question shaped by human imagination. The legend's survival into the present day speaks less to hidden gold than to the power of narrative. It endures because it invites participation, interpretation, and hope. Yet when examined through the lens of modern investigation, it also teaches restraint. Not every story resolves into discovery. Some remain as they began, defined not by what is found, but by what is sought. By the time the Lost Dutchman Mine reached its place as one of the most enduring legends in American history, it had long ceased to be simply a question of gold. What remained was a story shaped by time, belief, and repetition, carried forward by generations who searched not only for wealth, but for meaning in a landscape that resisted certainty. The Superstition Mountains became inseparable from this story, their harsh beauty and unpredictable nature reinforcing the sense that some places are not meant to yield easy answers. The persistence of the legend reveals much about the historical moment from which it emerged. The 19th-century American frontier was defined by expansion, uncertainty, and the belief that opportunity lay just beyond the horizon. Gold rushes transformed that belief into action, drawing people across continents and into environments they scarcely understood. When those opportunities faded, stories of lost or hidden wealth offered a way to preserve hope. The Lost Dutchman Mine fit perfectly into this pattern, promising that success had not vanished, but merely been delayed or concealed. Jacob Waltz's transformation from an obscure prospector into a central figure of legend illustrates how individual lives can be reshaped by collective memory. What is verifiable about him is limited and ordinary. An immigrant, a miner, a man who lived quietly and died without documented wealth. What followed his death was not evidence, but interpretation. His name became a vessel into which expectations, assumptions, and desires were poured. Over time, the man receded and the symbol took his place. The Superstition Mountains themselves played an active role in sustaining the story. Their difficult terrain, limited access, and genuine dangers discouraged definitive conclusions. Each failed search could be explained by the land's complexity rather than by the absence of a mine. In this way, geography protected the legend as effectively as any secrecy ever could. The mountains did not confirm belief, but they allowed it to persist. The legend's endurance also reflects a broader human tendency to prefer mystery over resolution. A story without an ending invites participation. It allows each generation to reinterpret clues, challenge assumptions, and imagine discovery anew. The Lost Dutchman Mine offered this possibility without requiring proof. Its appeal lay not in certainty, but in the promise that certainty remained attainable, just out of reach. Modern historical analysis does not strip the legend of its value, it clarifies its meaning. When examined carefully, the Lost Dutchman Mine becomes less a story about deception or failure and more a reflection of how history is constructed. It demonstrates how oral testimony, repetition, and selective emphasis can elevate possibility into belief. It also shows how absence of evidence can be transformed into evidence of absence only when examined with discipline and restraint. The continued fascination with the Lost Dutchman Mine also reveals something enduring about the relationship between people and place. The American Southwest has long been viewed as a landscape of extremes, where survival and opportunity exist side by side. The Superstition Mountains embody this duality. They inspire both reverence and challenge, drawing people not because they are welcoming, but because they resist easy understanding. In this context, the legend becomes an expression of respect as much as desire. For Indigenous communities, the legend exists alongside a much older relationship with the land, one rooted not in extraction, but in continuity and meaning. The Superstition Mountains were never empty or unknown, they were known differently. The contrast between these perspectives highlights how legends often emerge when unfamiliar landscapes are viewed through the lens of ambition rather than knowledge. Recognizing this distinction adds depth to the story and reminds us that not all value is measured in material terms. Today, the Lost Dutchman Mine remains unproven, and it may always remain so. Modern technology, historical records, and geological understanding offer little support for its existence as described in legend. Yet the story persists, not because it defies explanation, but because it fulfills a narrative role. It speaks to the enduring hope that effort and belief might still uncover something extraordinary, even when evidence suggests otherwise. In this way, the Lost Dutchman Mine occupies a unique place in history. It is not a footnote waiting to be resolved, nor a mystery awaiting discovery. It is a case study in how legends form, evolve, and endure. It teaches that history is not only a record of events, but also a record of what people choose to believe and why. The true legacy of the Lost Dutchman Mine is therefore not hidden gold, but understanding. It invites reflection on the limits of knowledge, the power of storytelling, and the ways in which landscapes shape imagination. It reminds us that some stories matter not because they are proven, but because they reveal something essential about the human experience. In the end, the Superstition Mountains still stand, unchanged by the countless searches carried out within them. They hold no confirmed mine, no revealed fortune, and no final answer. What they hold instead is silence, endurance, and a reminder that history does not always reward persistence with discovery. Sometimes, it rewards it with insight. The Lost Dutchman Mine remains lost not because it is hidden, but because it exists in the space between fact and belief, where legend lives on long after certainty has faded.